This is Season 2, Episode 1 of Bad Books of the Bible, and we are back with what can only be described as an essential chapter in Jewish history.
Today we're talking about 1 Maccabees, Chapter 1. We're going to cover the rise of the tyrant and madman Antiochus Epiphanes, the Jews that tried to accommodate Greek dominance, and then the start of Jewish resistance.
I'm Joel Miller.
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy.
Jamie, we're back. We covered Tobit in our first season.
Yep.
And now we're digging into yet another book of the Bible that some people may not actually think is in the Bible, but secretly or not so secretly is.
That's right.
We're talking about 1 Maccabees. And it's one of those books that a lot of people have familiarity with as being in the Apocrypha, the so-called Apocrypha, as being in and among these bad books of the Bible, but they're not super familiar with it usually.
Yeah.
And I'll confess, I wasn't super familiar with it as we first started getting into this particular one. I'd definitely spent far more time in the more devotional or wisdom-oriented books of the so-called Apocrypha.
Right.
So to dig into this book and just a purely historical book was a lot of fun to begin with.
Yeah.
And was highly interesting.
One of the things that makes this one unique, though, I think, is that it does get some press, even by people who don't want it bound up with Scripture.
Yeah.
Because it is so historically significant. And it was such a big part of the life of the Jewish people in the time just prior to the birth of Christ.
So, like, if you think about starting at the beginning, in this case, it's actually good to start before the beginning.
Yeah.
So in the grand sweep of history, of Jewish history, you know, we did look at Tobit, and in the book of Tobit, you have the historical setting of Jews in exile.
Yeah.
This book is placed significantly after that. It is, in fact, after they have returned.
Yeah. And
just before the book begins, we have, I shouldn't say just before, that makes it sound like it was minutes. But before, couple hundred years before the book really gets going, the Jews were allowed to return to their homeland by Cyrus.
Yeah.
As they returned, they began to reinstitute the practice of the law. They rebuilt the temple. They did all the kinds of things that you would expect them to do.
Yeah.
That forms the kind of historical backdrop for the action in 1 Maccabees, which picks up when the Persian Empire that had kind of facilitated that whole return came collapsing under the rule of Alexander the Great.
So when we're looking at the period of the Maccabees, we're talking about something that's fairly late in the Second Temple Jewish period, shortly before Christ. And the action really kicks off in Maccabees with Antiochus Epiphanes around 175 BC. And the text itself focuses really on about a 40-year period there. Mm-hmm. The writer of Maccabees, we don't know a lot about him. He doesn't really identify himself in 1 Maccabees, but he seems to know a lot about the geography of Palestine. Bruce Metzger, the great scholar, he said that it was obviously the work of a plain and honest chronicler. He went on to say that he was careful about the historical sequences, but he wasn't out there trying to theorize or go overly political. Yet at the same time, even though we don't know who this person was that wrote it, the way he treats the revolt, the Jewish revolt at this time, is very sympathetic. It's led many to speculate that he had an interest in promoting the Hasmonean dynasty, which we're going to identify and talk about in a little bit.
Yeah.
The bottom line is the author was a serious historian, and he wanted to be as accurate as he could. And I think this is one of the reasons this book has really stood the test of time, and was even used by the famous ancient historian of the Jews, Flavius Josephus.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that is very well attested to and holds a strong place in antiquity.
Yeah. It's interesting that, and we mentioned this, in the teaser episode to this season 2, that we use the term apocryphal to refer to things that are of dubious provenance, that are of doubtful veracity. But the underlying message of First Maccabees is, pretty well rock solid.
Yeah.
The author has his slant, he has his own take that he's presenting, but it's objective history to the extent that is a thing in, the first century.
Certainly.
I actually find that comment by Bruce Metzger a little bit amusing, that the work of First Maccabees is the plain work of an honest chronicler, he says. In fact, then he uses the term, this is obviously the case. This is obviously the work of a plain and honest chronicler.
Yeah.
Now, it's funny because you can juxtapose that with the Jewish annotated Apocrypha, which uses the very same adverb and refers to him as obviously a partisan of the Hasmonean family. So, what's obvious to somebody is less obvious to somebody else.
Honestly partying.
If you're going to be a partisan, you might as well be partying.
That's right.
One thing interesting about the style of the author, like if we want to cover this for a second, he's quick and dirty. Like a lot of Old Testament narratives, they're sometimes called like schematic narratives, or they have terms that are used to describe the compactness of them, the terseness of them, the efficiency of those narratives. And the writer of First Maccabees has patterned his work on those writers, and that's the same kind of writing he's doing. This is tight. Yeah. This is compact. And it feels like Hemingway would be hard pressed to write more compactly than the writer of First Maccabees. Yeah. And one of the ways you see that pop up right off is how efficiently and quickly he moves from Alexander the Great all the way to Antiochus Epiphanes. And we should just cover that real quick because, the book does. Sure. And we might as well cover it since we're covering the book. But it starts with a quick summary of Alexander's rise in Macedonia. Yeah. And then his conquering spree eastward, which results in the defeat of the Persian emperor Darius III. Yeah. And then ultimately Alexander's annexation of the Persian Empire, which, you're talking about a guy that's conquered, as the old saying goes, the known world. Yeah. And that wasn't exactly true. There was plenty more known, and he didn't get there. He got kicked out of India. And he ended up finding his way back to Babylon, where he died. Before he died, though, the author of First Maccabees says this: he fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they became tributary to him. Yeah. Alexander the Great, as presented in the Bible, is a boss. This guy has kicked everybody's tail. Yeah. And he has set himself up as the big man. But all good things must come to an end. Alexander the Great died around 32 or 33 years old in 323 BC, right? Nobody knows exactly why. He was like a famous drinker, and he would go on massive bouts of alcoholic inebriation and consumption. But people suspect poisoning, which wouldn't even be all that outside the realm of possibility. He was becoming more despotic, as you might have even guessed from the summary in First Maccabees. He had elevated himself and was alienating in the process his own people. And one of the suspicions is that his old tutor, Aristotle, might have even had a hand in the poisoning of him. Regardless, he died and he was off the picture.
One of the things that's helpful to remember about this period in history is the way kingdoms worked. You could have a kingdom subservient to another, building these massive empires. There are still lesser kings And what we will find in this story is that this can create complications as sort of the, parent corporation, so to speak, changes hands. It messes with the subset nations and kingdoms.
Yeah. You got franchise operators who don't like the way it's going back at HQ.
Exactly.
That's what you're saying.
So when Alexander the Great died, it was a mess. The generals were fighting for control of his empire. He had some sort of succession plan, but it just was bad. Verse 8 says that his officers seized control. So his empire was falling apart, and the successors couldn't hold it together. Essentially, 4 main powers emerged from that.
Alexander was trying to build like a one world empire, right? Where he owns everything.
Yeah.
Instead, it got, cut into 4 pieces. There was Cassander, who ruled in Macedonia back in his old stomping grounds.
Yeah.
Ptolemy, who went down to Egypt, Ptolemy the First. This is the same Greek general that founded the Library of Alexandria. Alexander, he got to Alexandria and founded it, quote unquote, but then left like minutes later, basically. And so it was up to Ptolemy to really build the city.
Right.
And in fact, the state that became that period of Egypt, that was him. Seleucus Nicator in Babylonia, and then Lysimachus in Syria. This is the same division, interestingly enough, that was alluded to or mentioned in Daniel chapter 11, verse 4. But what's especially important for us to remember in the middle of all of this is where little old Israel is. It's basically right smack dab in the middle of all these barking dogs. Now, if you've ever been in the middle of a fight of barking dogs, that's how Israel felt in the middle of this. So the control, so like the Persian Empire falls with Alexander the Great, and you've got instead all these vying kingdoms taking over for the various pieces and parts of his empire, which you really can't even call it an empire. I mean, he just he wandered through, he conquered some stuff. None of it was really truly his. It all fell apart the minute he died, and it fell apart in these 4 ways. And one of those groups that it fell under was the Ptolemies of Egypt. And they were, in fact, the people who were like nominally in charge of Israel.
Right.
Not forever, though, because the Seleucids, who are related to Seleucus Nicator of Babylonia, they decided, you know what? Actually, we want it. And so they took it. And what you have with Israel is stuck between these vying world powers, and they happen to be right smack dab in the middle. And they are kind of like the football that goes back and forth between these rival teams. So this is where we are at the end of the opening of First Maccabees, which is like 9 verses long. It talks about the officers began to rule each in his own place. That is the very efficient way that the author describes what I just said, right? But then here's this important transition. This is verse 9. They all put on crowns after his death, and so did their descendants after them. The whole book is going to be about some of those descendants.
Right.
For many years. And this is the killer part, the important part. They caused many evils on the earth. So basically, this rowdy group of generals and their descendants are just as arrogant. They're just as domineering as Alexander the Great, but they're more fractious than even he managed to be because, he had his own one agenda. They have multiple agendas. So they have in their own places now set up their own miniature kingdoms, and they are, they've elevated themselves, and they are going to inflict evil on the people underneath them.
And that's such a great line summarizing up that section. I love how the narrator handles this. And he transitions to the next part of his narrative when he says, "From them came forth a sinful root." There's a lot of numbers that get used in this book. And as we said, he was a careful historian. The narrator was a careful historian here. And he uses few sets of dates.
It's not like these people had an agreed upon calendar.
Right.
It's normal that you would have some incongruities on dates.
So when we note the numbers here, it's important to recognize that there is a little bit of discussion among scholars about things related to the dates. But we can establish a number of things pretty carefully and accurately in history. And then so from there, scholars kind of tinker with this date, that date, or the other. I think we'll do our best in this series to bring all the years into numbers that we would understand. But as we consider the Greek domination that began among the Jews, remember in the Old Testament, over and over, God is instructing the Jewish people or God's people, the Hebrews, to be wholly devoted to him, to be separate from the nations, to follow the law, to follow the customs that were handed down and given to them by God. Well, the influence of the predominant culture, surprise, surprise, affected many of God's people. It almost seems kind of humorous to our modern ears to read the things that were tempting to them. In particular, I like that in the text, it talks about the gymnasium.
Like, we're not talking about Gold's Gym or Lifetime Fitness. I mean, this is like a school to be inculcated in Greek culture. It includes athletics, but it includes education. It's like indoctrination.
Yeah. So part of the difficulty is that they were not only being inculcated completely in a Hellenistic way of thinking, but this also meant that the outward marks of Jewishness and Jewish maleness, of circumcision, would be revealed. Mm-hmm. So in essence, they were just embarrassed of the covenant and the marks of the covenant, and they wanted to be fully accepted by their non-Jewish neighbors.
Wow. Is this what Paul is getting at, by the way, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he talks about seeking to remove the marks of circumcision? Is that like a connection?
I don't know, but it is interesting that he uses that same language that we find in Maccabees.
I want to say something really quickly here about Antiochus Epiphanes' name. So historically speaking, this is Antiochus the fourth. He's the fourth guy to carry that name. And then he attaches to himself this surname of Epiphanes, or this sobriquet of Epiphanes, which means essentially the manifestation of God. So he's like, right. This is his opinion of himself. I mean, this guy is really pretty full of himself. The funny thing is his detractors, his enemies, of whom, he makes many and they grow by the day, refer to him not as Epiphanes, but as Epimanes, which means like crazy man.
Wow.
This is the kind of guy we're talking about here. He is a very prideful, but not too stable dude.
And so it's no surprise that Antiochus invaded Egypt twice.
Not once, but twice.
On his way back, again, not once, but twice, he sacks Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. That didn't go over well with the Jews. So the first invasion, which is narrated in this chapter, that took place around 169 BC. Mm-hmm. So in his second invasion, which is covered in more detail in 2 Maccabees, he ends up in a bit of a scuffle with Rome. And he gets frustrated. He withdraws from Egypt. He vents his rage on Jerusalem again. Bottom line is, both times he got a lot of plunder, and we are going to talk about the mess that his plundering of Jerusalem caused.
This is kind of a reflection on the state of the economy in these days, right? So the way Antiochus Epiphanes raises money is to plunder temples.
Yeah.
And this sort of makes sense. Like, if you're loosely read in history, the Vikings, they like to stroll down to, Ireland and northern Scotland and raid monasteries. Why? Because there are precious things there in monasteries. So it's like, if you know that there were valuables, you go to where there are valuables to take them. Well, ancient peoples put their valuables in temples. And so this is how, not only is this guy like arrogant beyond belief,
Sure.
he fundraises by basically robbing temples because that's where the good stuff is. And so this is like a policy of his. This is the way he does it. It's kind of crazy.
Wow.
The book itself, the narrator says that he took the silver and the gold, the costly vessels, and he took all the hidden treasures that he found, and he went back to his own land. And then the book breaks into a lament, you can imagine like a psalmic kind of lament. He shed much blood and spoke with great arrogance. Israel mourned deeply in every community. Rulers and elders groaned. Young women and young men became faint, and the beauty of the women faded. Every bridegroom took up the lament. She who sat in the bridal chamber was mourning. Even the land trembled for its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was clothed with shame. That is the way this particular passage, this moment of the story concludes, in essentially preparation for the same thing, only worse, to happen again.
So then as time went on, he started sending a tribute in to collect taxes, basically, from the various cities in Judah. Mm-hmm. He's taxing people and bringing military force to do so. So the text actually describes him as being deceitful, because he was coming in and collecting the tribute, but ultimately ends up turning on them. It said that he fell upon the city, he dealt it a severe blow, and he destroyed many people of Israel. I mean, we're talking plunder, fire. It was a mess. They took people captive. It got ugly quick. In order to establish their control, they very quickly set up a fortress. Now, the precise location of the fortress, scholars have debated, but it was somewhere in Jerusalem near the temple. Many scholars contend that it was on the south end of the temple. So if you look at a map of Jerusalem, you can conceive of it that way. But the bottom line is it was in close proximity to their place of worship, which was the central focus of all of God's people. And naturally, it became a major source of contention.
It's interesting that they went ahead and put the fortress there to guard the temple, because what you're getting a picture of is, unlike, in fact, their prior oppressors, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, who didn't seem to care too much about the Israelites worshiping their own God, doing their own thing. And in fact, when the Persians sent them back home, they actually let them use their own Torah as their law book, basically. Yeah. This is not the Seleucid way. Antiochus, he wants to cut it off. He wants to shut the whole picture down. And so he is going to keep them out of the temple. He's not going to let them worship their God. Instead, as we'll get to see here in just a second, he's going to try to impose his worship, not of himself, but his pantheon, his way of worshiping on everybody under his domain.
Yeah, and the text actually describes that citadel, that fortress, as an evil adversary of Israel at all times.
Wow.
So they were not happy about this at all.
So Antiochus, he writes to the whole kingdom, it says, and says that they should all be one people. And they should, this is the important part, give up their particular customs. So everything that makes you a Jew, forget about it.
Yeah.
That's off the table now. Instead, you're going to be a Seleucid. You're going to be like me. You're going to be like us. And so the interesting thing here is it says that many, even from Israel, and this is in the translation I'm looking at here, gladly adopted his religion.
Wow.
So this is after all this destruction. This is after people have been dragged off to slavery. I wouldn't say that they were gladly in the sense that they're like, yeah, let's do this. Sure. I think it's gladly like, make all this suffering stop. I'll trade anything you say in order to make this misery stop.
Go along to get along.
Let's just interrupt the flow of this for a second to say this is the contention of the whole book right here, that some people threw it away and some people kept it. And the people that kept it are the heroes in the story, and we're going to be focusing on them hardcore throughout the rest of the episodes in this season, but this is the moment in which the folks who back at the old gymnasium were hiding their circumcision. This is where they very gladly say, never mind, I'm never being a Jew again. Right? I'll just do it your way.
Yeah.
That's the tension of the story. They gladly adopted his religion, they said, and then they sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And it gets even worse than this, because like if you imagine later on the Roman government, early on, the Roman government was fine with Christians not sacrificing on behalf of the emperor. It wasn't a big deal, right? Because there were hardly any Christians. So the fact that there's like this noise at the periphery of some people that are not going to follow along, big whooping deal, like we're Rome, we can handle it.
Right.
But then eventually it's not the case anymore. And the Christians are growing in number like crazy. And all of a sudden, here's a massive number of people who are deciding not to follow along and to worship the emperor as told. They're not participating in the ancient pieties. Now they're a threat because there's so many of them.
Right.
And so that's when you get the crackdowns of the late 3rd century and the early 4th century,
right,
before Constantine shows up on the scene. That's when that happens. And it happens because there's so many Christians. You got to root this out.
Right.
Well, Antiochus knew that also back when, and he was doing the same thing. So he basically sent guys out to force people to sacrifice. And basically he said, if you won't do this, you're going to die. So the people that chose to resist him had to go on the lam. They became fugitives. Like either you sacrifice or you are a fugitive.
It's important to keep in mind that they were forbidden to practice their own faith, and they were being commanded to do something that they would be forbidden to do.
Right.
So it was both suppressing their religion, their belief, and enforcing them into practices and beliefs that they were not comfortable with.
Yeah.
And when we remember Israel, they conceived of themselves as a special covenanted people of God whose obedience was tied directly to blessings and also to difficulties that came at the hands of pagan rulers like this one.
Okay, so let's just get into one of the ways that this manifests. And this is one of those very interesting historical moments when Ezra rolls on back from captivity. What does he lug along with him but the Torah, which, theoretically, at least according to the scholars, it was edited during that time, like into the body of books that we look at and call the Old Testament primarily. That was worked on then, the Torah and all that. Okay. So that's what he brings back with him, with the blessing of that government. No big deal to them.
Yeah.
Those books become the core of the Jewish piety. Those books become the core of the whole thing. Obviously, they have the temple. That's super important. It's been rebuilt. But the whole ethical mindset of the Jewish people is at this point informed by scripture. So when Ezra comes back, first thing he does is he reads them the law, right, from beginning to end.
Yeah.
And the Levites move in and out of the crowd, giving the interpretation, it says. So this is now part of their whole worldview, is that they are a people of the book. This is when this happens. Okay, historically. And then here comes Antiochus, and he comes in and it says the books of the law that they found, i.e. his agents, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. This is like the temple being destroyed again. This is like everything true, everything that is about their own faithfulness, about the ability to express their piety is being ruined in front of their eyes. And it's intentional. They are deliberately destroying these books because they're trying to cut them off from their own practice.
I mean, there's some really brutal stuff in this chapter. They put to death the women who had their children circumcised in obedience to the law of God.
We should have probably put a note at the beginning that said not to listen to the show with your children in the car.
Right.
I mean, that is a level of brutality, of inhumanity that is impossible to get your head around. And that was happening to these people.
Now, there's something I don't want to pass over here, and that was in the midst of their attacks on the Jewish people. They actually desecrated the temple itself and the altar. the author talks about the specific day, and that can be put sometime in early December 167 BC.
A specific day, like it's so bad they know the exact day it happened. Like, we are not forgetting this. This is the day that will live in infamy, to quote FDR.
That's exactly it. I mean, it was one of those days in history where that's the marker. You remember where you were before, and you remember how you were after, but you'll never forget that day, especially. We learn in 2 Maccabees that they may have actually made a sacrifice to the Greek god Zeus. We're talking like the god of Olympus, right? The chief god of the Greeks. And we see Daniel talking about this issue and calling it the abomination of desolation,
which gets picked up in the New Testament.
Yeah. So we're talking about the ultimate of desecrations, not only for the Gentiles to go into the temple, but to then turn the altar into one where they sacrifice to another god.
The worst of the worst.
What's Antiochus thinking? I don't really know, but these are Jewish rebels. He probably sees the stability of his rule as threatened by these people. And so
i.e. he sees his rule threatened by faithful Jews.
Yes.
Like their practice is going to undermine his rule.
Exactly. And so he wants to put them in their place.
Yeah.
I don't know if there was a sense that he thought that he could go in there and inspire them to rally behind him.
Yeah.
If that was the case, it didn't work.
In fact, it didn't work so bad that it blew up in his hands. And this is the transition in the story. We're gonna jump into episode 2 here at this point.
Yeah.
Or we're prepping to jump into episode 2 at this point. But basically, the scripture says, "But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to go along with this." They were not going to do this. They chose to die rather than be defiled or profane the Holy Covenant, and they did die.
Yeah.
Very great wrath came upon Israel. That's the way this chapter ends.
Yeah.
I'm just going to use that to say this: if you're in movie land, if you're thinking of movies, this is the end of the big opening scene in which everything looks utterly dire. And the hero's dad has been killed, but then the hero sees it happen and he's like, all right, I'm coming back. I'm going to avenge this. I'm going to take care of this. I'm going to do whatever. That's where we're starting next week. That is what happens now. So Antiochus has played his hand.
Yeah.
It has dealt a devastating blow to the people of Israel. And there are some that are getting ready to say, not today, Satan.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to happen next week.
I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when we see what happens when Mattathias and his sons put their foot down.